Marjorie leaned over to grab a stack of papers she'd just printed. She thrust them in front of Bob. "If you could read these over to be sure you approve, and then initial each page." She handed him a pen. He sighed and read the excruciating list one more time. He didn't prove at all, but he initialed the pages anyway. Marjorie beamed. "Excellent!" She shuffled the papers and stapled some of them together. "Here are your schedules," she said. "Ralpho will visit in the morning, and the rest of your activities are blocked out on the calendar." She handed Bob a key and a little booklet. "Key to 𝓫𝓮𝓪𝓿𝓮 and a book of camp rules," she explained. "Oh, lovely, a book of rules." Bob needed more rules, like he needed a few more jobs or a few more kids. He didn't say that out loud, he just took the rule book and the key. "Have fun, and don't hesitate to ask if you need anything," Marjorie said. Bob nodded at her, gave Ralpho one last look, and then headed outside. He noticed his step felt lighter. He was tempted to do a little spin as he headed out the door. Instead, he turned to Ralpho one last time and tipped an imaginary hat to his new friend. "Thanks, buddy," Bob said quietly. Ralpho had given Bob the most profound sense of gratification he'd had in weeks. Oh, okay. Bob pulled the last load of luggage into 𝓫𝓮𝓪𝓿𝓮 and stepped back outside to catch his breath. Basically an A-frame with a shallow porch, 𝓫𝓮𝓪𝓿𝓮 was a simple log structure with two small side windows, one picture window in the front, and a small window on the loft level. Bob shook his head at the cabin. It wasn't the 5-star hotel he had envisioned spending his vacation in. "Bob?" Wanda called. He went inside the cabin, and Wanda gave him what he'd come to think of as the look. The look was a lips quirked to the side with an eyebrow raised expression that meant, "You're not doing what I want you to do." "What?" Bob asked. "You need to get a move on. It's time for the opening day picnic," Wanda complained, bustling over to Bob and waving the schedule under his nose. "See? 4 p.m. We're going to be late." "No one is on time for the picnics," Bob said. Wanda threw a pair of khaki shorts and navy blue polo shirt in his direction. "Here, change into these. You smell like sweat. You think?" Wanda's words had sounded accusatory, and he wanted to ask her how he was supposed to have gotten all their stuff to the cabin without working up a little sweat. Instead, he watched Wanda set up Cindy's sleeping kit, a small vinyl pouch tucked into a white wicker basket. The pouch held the sleep mask and earplugs, and the basket included a cup of water with a lid. From early in their relationship, Bob had known that Wanda was a loud snorer. She'd fallen asleep on his shoulder at an outdoor concert once, and her snores were somehow audible over the loud music. When they had kids, he found out the snoring thing was genetic, and unfortunately it came with a propensity toward light sleep and an overreaction to being awakened by loud noises or bright light. I swear Scott has gotten better at writing. These days, Wanda and the kids all wore earplugs and blackout sleep masks to bed. Bob never bothered with a mask, but Wanda's snores forced him to wear earplugs, and even those weren't enough to keep him from feeling like he spent every night in a working sawmill. That was another thing about his trip that displeased him. All 4 of his snoring family members in one small area. Bob didn't see a lot of sleep coming his way over the next 7 days. One of the reasons he got such a kick out of the bunny call was he thought it would mete out a bit of justice. I don't know. I've never seen that word before. If he had to be tortured all night, at least they'd get a little shock in the morning. True. 𝓫𝓮𝓪𝓿𝓮 was as basic on the inside as it was on the outside. On the first floor, the cabin held a double daybed with a pull-out trundle bed beneath, a table with 5 chairs, a chest of drawers, and a small refrigerator. A door led to a tiny bathroom. Up in the loft, the 2 twin beds with matching nightstands were tucked under the roof's steep pitch. The cabin had no shelves or closets. Instead, coat hooks lined several of the walls, and low benches were set under the hooks, presumably to hold luggage. Wanda had already stashed all of their suitcases neatly in rows. She'd also piled snacks, paper plates and cups, and a roll of paper towels on top of the refrigerator. "I thought there would be bunk beds," Aaron had said when Bob reached the cabin. "Bunk beds would have been fun." When I was your cage? Oh my gosh, I really am bad at reading. "When I was your age, your uncle and I were complaining that we had to have bunk beds," Bob told his son. We thought twin beds would have been fun. Yeah, Aaron said, but you're old. Bob wondered what that had to do with it. He didn't think himself as old, although with each passing day the label got closer to sticking. But even if he was old, did old automatically mean wrong? He was thinking to think it did. Bob surveyed the cabin's beds, indulging in a moment's anticipation for the bunny call. Every bed in the cabin was covered with a red blanket, and the sheets were dark green. This gave the place a decidedly Christmassy feel that was heightened by the green and red striped curtains on the windows. Bob thought it was a little weird, and had said so when he first entered the cabin. But Wanda had insisted, "It's festive." Exactly my point, Bob had said. Although the boys didn't like the lack of bunk beds, they did like one of the cabin's features. It had a trapdoor in the floor. Oh god. What's that for? Aaron? Oh my god. Aaron asked when he found it. Bob made Aaron wait while he dropped through the trapdoor and checked what was below. Turned out it was just the cabin's crawl space. Bob figured they decided to put the crawl space door inside to prevent critters from getting under the cabins, or maybe it was an insulation thing. Whatever it was, it delighted the boys, who went in and out through the crawl space several times, jabbering about hidden treasure. Wanda snapped her fingers in front of Bob's face. "Why are you just standing there?" She gave him a push. "Change!" Obediently, Bob began peeling off his sweaty clothes, replacing them with fresh ones. When he was done changing, he stood at mock attention in front of his wife, who had already changed into a simple emerald green sundress. "Do I pass muster?" Wanda smiled, gave him a hug and kissed him on the cheek. She recoiled. "Oh, Ruff, you need a shave." "I'm on vacation," Bob reminded her. "That's an excuse to give your wife whisker burn?" Bob sighed. Would he ever get a break from anything? He picked up his shaving kit. "Not now," Wanda said. "We're late." Bob dropped the kit in frustration. "Well then, you just tell me exactly when and where and how, and I'll do exactly what you want," he said. Wanda didn't seem to hear the acrimony in his words. She probably thought he was serious because she smiled at him and linked her arm through his. "Let's go to a picnic." Spread out over a vast expanse of lawns sloping down to a sandy beach, the picnic was a chaotic mass of food, games, and socializing. Bob wanted to run and hide in the forest the second he and his family reached the edges of the tumulus. What? What is that? Why are there so many big random words I don't know? Camp 𝓑𝓮𝓫𝓶𝓮 welcomes you. A bright green banner shouted from its place stretched between two massive fir trees. Bob doubted that Camp 𝓑𝓑𝓮𝓫 welcomed any of them. It was more probable that the camp wanted them to all go away. In fact, Bob was pretty sure Lake Armadi wished the camp that had never been built. Bob had entered the architecture firm as an apprentice right out of school, and in the 12 years he worked there, he'd learnt a lot about form and function and energy and landscape. Walking sites to prepare plans, he often had a sense of when a place welcomed a structure and when it didn't. Not that he ever shared the tidbit with anyone. He kept his intuitive sense of a place in mind when he designed structures, but he never told his clients he was repositioning a building on a site because the earth wanted it that way. He had some sort of weird sense about land and nature, but he wasn't stupid. "Come on, Bob," Wanda tugged on his arm. "Stop loitering. You look like a deer in headlights." "I feel like a deer in headlights." That was a weird laugh. "I'll probably be mounted on one of the lodge walls by the end of the week." "Very funny," Wanda towed Bob to the end of a row of picnic tables. They were lined up, covered with dark green vinyl cloths and valiantly trying to hold several tons of food. Wanda handed him a heavy-duty paper plate. "We might as well eat while the kids play. Then I'll coral them and help them with their own meals." Bob looked around for the kids. The boys appeared to have become ninja warriors. They wore green headbands now, and they were having sword fights with long sticks. He glanced toward a clutter of toddlers clambering down a clown who was smearing paint on a red-headed girl's face. Cindy was hopping up and down next to the girl. Me too, me too!" She squealed loudly enough so Bob could hear her clearly from a great distance. "Make me buzzy honeybee," Cindy commanded. Bob winced and turned back to the food. He hated clowns. "Doesn't it smell good?" Wanda gestured at the platters of potato salad, bean salad, macaroni salad, pasta salad, green salad, deviled eggs, raw veggies, and dip, chips and dip, baked beans, and various casseroles that were covering the picnic tables. Honestly, all I can smell is burnt hot dogs, Bob said. A barbecue was set up halfway between the food tables and the lodge. From the charred smells and flames belching into the air far too high for safety, Bob wasn't sure the chef, a skinny camp employee with a narrow, flushed face, knew what he was doing. Wanda wrinkled her nose. The hot dogs are why I encouraged Cindy to get her face painted, but really, can't you smell the dill in this salad? And the thyme in this one? Give them a chance. Woof, Bob said before dutifully sniffing the salads. What? He couldn't smell anything except overcooked barbecue. Wanda giggled. Come on, you're holding up the line. Bob sighed and started dishing up the salads. While he piled food on his plate, he tried not to dread the inevitable scene that would unfold when Cindy realized there were hot dogs being consumed all around her. Cindy thought hot dogs were cruel. I can't eat doggies. Cindy had protested the first time hot dogs were presented to her. No manner of explanation convinced her that the term hot dog was not precisely descriptive of what she was eating. Bob, Wanda gave him a gentle shove. Honey, whatever you're thinking about, you can think about later. Come on. Wanda led him to a long picnic table filled with laughing couples. Are these seats taken? Wanda asked one of the couples. Nope, they're all yours. A large boisterous woman with big hair and a mouth to match sang out. Pull up a bench. She laughed as if she had said the funniest thing in the world. Her laugh was a high-pitched trill that sounded like a bird's mating call. Her husband, a small, sandy-haired man with sunburnt ears, glanced up and offered an unconvincing replica of a smile. Bob matched it with his own social tooth-baring. Wanda plopped down on the bench and scooted in to make room for Bob. I'm Darlene, the large woman said, and this is Frank. Yes. She pointed at the guy with the sunburnt ears. Frank lifted a fork, then returned to eating. Don't mind him, Darlene said. When he gets food in front of him, he forgets how to talk. Eats like a horse, my Frank. And look at him. It's not fair. I eat a carrot and I gain a pound. Bob had no idea what to say to that, so he let Wanda handle it. He heard her say something sympathetic while he put his attention to his food. The bench was hard and narrow, and it hurt his butt. He shifted, and he whacked his knee on the picnic table frame. He shifted again, and a splinter the size of a small knife jabbed him in the thigh. A pair of flies dive-bombed his plate, and he shooed them away. This was supposed to be fun. Oh, this is supposed to be fun? Sorry, my intonation isn't great today. He stabbed a chunk of potato and stuffed it in his mouth. It wasn't cooked all the way through. He hated crunchy potatoes and potato salad. He made a face as he chewed, wishing he could spit it out. Wishing he could spit out this whole miserable experience. While Bob ate, an animated conversation about camp activities began. Everyone at the table offered an opinion about what was going to be the most fun thing to do at Camp Britannia. Even Frank, who had finished eating, joined in with apparent glee when he talked about the tennis tournament that would start the next day. When Wanda piped up to tell everyone their whole family was competing in a capture the flag tournament next day, Bob almost groaned out loud. He'd forgotten he'd agreed to do that. The very thought of running around the woods trying to grab a piece of cloth made his teeth hurt. Bob had hoped that after the picnic he could spend the rest of the day sitting in a deck chair, but he was reminded why he rarely bothered being optimistic. The picnic ended at 6, and Wanda informed him that the family was signed up for team competitions from 6 to 9, in darts, horseshoes, and the card game hand and foot. After that, there would be a big campfire and a marshmallow roast. It's going to be great fun, Wanda chirped a little later as she cleaned up the ketchup smeared on Cindy's face. Predictably, Bob's family finished last in darts and horseshoes, and 7th in the hand and foot tournament, but Tyler was the only one who had a problem with that. Luckily, his disappointment didn't last long. Tyler was like his mum. He didn't dwell on what he couldn't change. He just moved on to the next possibility around the corner. That's what life is all about, Bob, Wanda always told him. Possibility. Every day is filled with possibility. You just have to look for it. Bob had thought this was adorable for the first few years he was with Wanda. Now it was grating on him. Maybe because he wasn't seeing a lot of possibilities that pleased him. This one, for instance, wasn't high on his good times list. The evening's campfire was a massive conflagration expelling smoke that hung in choking swirls over the entire lawn and bench. Bob's eyes burned, and his throat felt raw. "Look at the big fire, Daddy," Cindy said, tugging on his hand so they could move closer. Bob had instinctively grabbed Cindy's hand as soon as he'd seen the fire. She loved bright things, and he knew she'd make a beeline for it, which she did. "Fire's hot, sweetie," he said. "We'll look at it from over here." He tried leading her to a pair of lawn chairs well away from the flames, but she was having none of it. "No! Fire! Roost schmellows!" What? What is going on in this book? Cindy demanded. Wanda took Cindy's other hand. "I'll take her. You go sit." Bob let go of Cindy's hand. "Thanks." Wanda blew him a kiss and trotted with Cindy toward the marshmallows and crackling fire. Bob turned toward the lawn chairs, but of course they were all taken now. He scanned the area for a place to sit. Sighing, he went toward one of the logs set up around the campfire and awkwardly perched on the curved edge. A mosquito immediately appeared and landed on his knee. He smacked his knee and killed the mosquito. "I thought you guys didn't like smoke," he said to the dead bug. "I think they get used to it," a balding man with a big gut said as he dropped onto the log next to Bob. "Maybe they build up a tolerance in places like this." His voice was deep and smooth. He could have been a radio personality. "Think so?" Bob said non-committally. Yeah. He held out his hand. "Bob Mackenzie. Stephen Bell." The man shook Bob's hand. "Actually," he said, "I think my theory's full of it. Mosquitoes don't live long enough to build up a tolerance. Did you know that the average female mosquito lives about 50 days and the average male lives about 10 days? "Figures," Bob said. "The females and the babies never leave them alone." Stephen laughed. "You got that right." He gestured toward a pair of very pretty blonde girls Bob guessed were 13 or 14. The girls were flirting with a couple teen boys wearing pants so baggy they were about to fall off. Or they worry themselves to death. "Those two girls are mine." The guy shook his head. "I don't sleep much." Bob nodded. "I can see why." "You have girls?" "One. She's just 3. 2 boys too. Fatherhood's not for the faint of heart," Stephen said. "But it's a heck of a lot of fun." Bob offered a socially acceptable nod that didn't represent at all what he was thinking. It was nearly 11 p.m. By the time this whole family was back in the cabin and the kids were ready for bed. The boys said good night and fell into their twin beds, asleep almost the second they hit the mattresses. Their snores began vibrating the exposed ceiling beams immediately. Cindy, on the other hand, was wound up. Wearing one of the cabin's extra quilts as a cape, she was dancing around the place shouting, "I'm a princess!" "If you're a princess, where's your crown?" Bob asked. "Oh, now you've done it, Bob," Wanda said. And sure enough, Cindy started crying because she didn't have a crown. "Oops," Bob said. Just oops. It took Wanda several minutes to convince Cindy that they can make her a princess crown during crafting time the next day. In the meantime, Cindy had an invisible crown. "Okay," Cindy finally said. Wanda and Bob sighed in relief. Cindy still wasn't ready to go to sleep. "Story," she begged, crawling into Bob's lap. Bob sat with his back against the metal frame of the double daybed. He was pretty sure the frame, in the previous life, had been a medieval torture device. It managed to attack both his spine and his kidneys at the same time. Bob wrapped his arms around Cindy and tried not to inhale her smoky scent. Normally Cindy smelled like strawberries and vanilla at night. The strawberry scent was from her shampoo and the vanilla was from the warm vanilla almond milk she liked to drink before bed. Wanda decided to skip the kids' bath time tonight because the day had been so long, and Cindy was already feeling bloopy from too many schmallows to make room for her usual before-bed treat. Bob watched Wanda open the window on the far side of the cabin. She was fanatical about having fresh air in the evening no matter how cold it was outside. At least it wasn't that frigid tonight. Wanda crossed the cabin, pulled back the covers, and slid in next to Bob. She looked at her daughter. "Okay, what story are we doing tonight?" she asked Cindy. This was the routine. Bob held his daughter and Wanda told the story. Bob could design and even build houses, but he couldn't put together a story to save his life. Wanda was a storyteller. "Caterpillar!" Cindy shrieked pretty much right into Bob's ear. "Cindy is the life of this story." I should say that. He cringed but didn't push her away. "Okay, Wanda leaned over and kissed the top of Cindy's head. She sneezed, then nestled close to Bob, laying her head on his shoulder. From there, she began to tell a convoluted story about a caterpillar who built his cocoon all wrong and had to redo it so he could become a butterfly. At one point, Bob was tempted to insert a couple architectural details regarding the building process, but he wisely remained silent. Good on you. Good on you. At the beginning of Wanda's story, Cindy kept piping up with her opinion about how things should go. Every time she did, she squirmed and ended up elbowing Bob in some sensitive area of his anatomy. Some sensitive area of his anatomy, okay. It was like trying to cuddle with a small kangaroo. Bob wasn't a huge fan of the experience, but about 5 minutes in, she closed her eyes and her body went limp. This was the part of the night Bob did like. In fact, he pretty much loved it. When Cindy relaxed, her sweet toddler pudge filled Bob's arms with pillowy, warm softness, and then holding her was one of the most sweet and comforting things in the world. Sometimes it was so comforting he forgot who he was and what he had to do the next day. He forgot to be overwhelmed and angry and resentful. It took him back to his childhood, to memories of snuggling his well-worn teddy bear. "Earplugs," Wanda whispered, holding them out. Bob took the earplugs and gently inserted them into Cindy's ears while Wanda took care of her own. She gave Bob a kiss on the cheek, put on her sleep mask and said "good night" as she held onto her side next to him. Wanda and Cindy started to snore almost simultaneously. Cindy's first whirring blat landed in the same ear she'd shrieked into a few minutes before. This time Bob shifted Cindy in his arms, but he didn't immediately transfer her to the trundle bed. He just sat there, holding his daughter and listening to his family's rumbling snores. Beyond the snores, the noises of the nighttime forest reached out to Bob's senses. That, combined with the tender sweetness of his family snuggling close, eased the remaining tension in his body. Nighttime in the forest was actually one of the things he'd been okay with about his trip. He remembered lying in his sleeping bag next to his dad, under the stars, listening to the crickets. Ever since then, nature's night sounds had soothed him. Bob tried to hear the crickets now, but all he could hear was Cindy's little popping splurt floops in his ear. That was okay too. Wait, was that an owl? Bob listened hard. Yes, an owl hooted not too far from the cabin. Bob's dad, a nature and animal lover, was interested in animal symbolism. He taught Bob that owls were often seen as harbingers of death, but they could also be portents of renewal and rebirth. What message did this owl have for Bob? Bob didn't know, but he did know that for these cherished moments holding Cindy, he could convince himself that he had good things in his life. He could talk himself into the all is well mentality Wanda lived out every day. Suddenly Bob stiffened. The image of an orange bunny with a white and black checked vest flitted into his mind. "Ralpho! Oh man," Bob whispered. How could he have signed up for his family for such a cruel prank? It was probably going to traumatize Cindy for life. Listening to the snoring concert going on around him, Bob thought about how upset his wife and kids always were when they were awakened abruptly. Doing that on purpose wasn't the nicest thing in the world. No. Tell the truth, Bob, he berated himself. The truth was that signing up his family for the bunny crew. I don't know how to say that word because it's a fake word. What had he been thinking? He'd been thinking about himself. Now he thought about his peacefully sleeping wife and kids. However put upon he might feel on his trip, taking it out on them wasn't justice at all. It was selfish and childish. He sighed. Well, it was too late now. Hopefully the bunny call wouldn't be so bad. Bob inched away from his wife and carefully placed Cindy in the trundle bed. Then he put in his own earplugs and lay back on his pillow. In spite of his exhaustion, he lay there a long time before he fell asleep. Bob sat up in bed and clawed at his earplugs. Digging them frantically from his ears, he felt like his heart hammer against his ribcage like it was desperate to get out. Sweat glued his grey t-shirt and boxer shorts to his body. What in the world? Usually Bob didn't sleep all that well, but he wasn't prone to panic attacks or night sweats. So what woke him up? He looked around the cabin. Was everything okay? It seemed to be. His wife and kids were snoring in a strangely endearing harmony of buzzing and honking tones. The doors were closed, but through the open window he could still hear the peaceful sounds to which he'd fallen asleep. Nothing appeared to be amiss. Bob tried to calm his breathing. but it wouldn't slow down. He concentrated to try and remember what he'd been dreaming before Ralpho. That was what he was dreaming about. He'd been dreaming about Ralpho. Obviously his guilt had followed him into his sleep. Bob took a deep breath and got out of bed. He grabbed the pen light on his keyring. Bob used his pen light to find safe passage past the end of the trunnel bed and then a few feet across the floor to the bathroom. There, he closed the door and turned on the light over the sink. He looked at himself in the mirror. Still the same Bob. Or was he? This Bob looked a little feral. His eyes were bloodshot and his hair stuck out. His mouth was stretched into a wide grimace. This Bob looked like he'd made a deal with the devil. Had he? Oh. Bob snorted and shook his head. He noticed his eyebrows were getting too bushy. In the last year or so, Bob had started losing hair on the top of his head, and he'd started growing hair where he didn't want any extra. How was that fair? Oh, forget fair. What purpose did it serve? Leaning over the sink, Bob ran cool water and splashed his face. While his family continued to snore, he thought about Ralpho again. He looked at his watch. It was 11:50 p.m. He'd barely slept before he woke up. This did not bode well for a good night's sleep. Just over 5 hours before Ralpho would show up. Could Bob call it off? If he could, how would he do it? Were the camp counselors available during the night? Yes. He remembered. The cabins had no phones, and Camp 𝓑𝓮𝓬𝓸𝓶 had no cell phone coverage, but an idle flip through the rulebook had revealed that every cabin was equipped with a large bell you could use to signal for help in case of an emergency. Bob didn't think that this was a bell-ringing emergency. In fact, he was pretty sure if he rang a bell to cancel the bunny call, they'd kick him out of the camp. Then again, Bob shook his head. He wasn't going to humiliate his family by ringing an emergency bell to cancel a prank, even if it might get him out of this so-called vacation. Besides, if he did that, they'd know what he'd set up. Bob leaned over the sink again and slurped some water, straightening and wiping his mouth. He decided he was making way too much out of a silly prank. Ralpho was just some kid in a rabbit suit, right? All Ralpho would do was scare the kids a little, probably annoy his wife, and that would be it. No big deal. Wasn't part of parenting getting the kids ready for the big bad world? If they could be undone by a noisy orange rabbit, how did they have any hope of surviving real-world battles like those Bob faced every day? Bob nodded at himself in the mirror and turned off the bathroom light. He'd convinced himself that the bunny call would be good for his kids. Bob was doing the kids a favour, and Wanda was a big girl. She could handle it. And if not, well, she did drag him to this absurd place. A little payback wouldn't be so bad, would it? Bob nodded again, and headed back to bed. Oh no. No! Bob lay on his side in the dark. How much time had passed since the last time he checked? He pressed the button on the side of his watch, and the tiny light revealed digital numbers informing him a mere 19 minutes had passed since he'd last checked. Compulsively checked the time. And before that 19 minutes, it had been 23 minutes. Before that, it had been 33 minutes. Before that, it was 37 minutes. Before that, it was 49 minutes. If he kept up this pattern, he'd be waking up every couple of minutes within the next half hour. Approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes of thrashing in bed and opening his eyes to check his watch. What a great night Bob was having. Apparently, he didn't believe all this rational arguments in favour of the bunny call. Bob closed his eyes and tried to go back to sleep. Sure enough. The next time he looked at his watch, 13 minutes had passed, then 7, and now 3. It was getting close to 3 a.m. 2 more hours. 1.5 hours. 1 hour. A half hour. 15 minutes. 5 minutes. His eyes felt like something had been trying to scrape its way out through the irises all night long. Bob looked around the cabin, but he only saw a whole lot of blackness. At home, the house was never this dark. Their home had exterior lights, and the subdivision had street lights. Camp 𝓑𝓮𝓬𝓸𝓶𝓮's cabins didn't have exterior lights because according to the camp's brochure, that would ruin the nature experience. Wanda had brought a nightlight from home, but the boys refused to let her plug it in. It will ruin the nature experience, Mum, they'd said in unison before, laughing uproariously. And so Cabin Nutter was nothing but a featureless void. If it wasn't for the sounds of his family's snores, Bob could have convinced himself he was alone in a vacuum. Bob held very still and listened. Was Ralpho on the move? Was he out there someplace? Was he right outside the cabin? Bob felt his arm hairs stand up and quiver in the dark. Wuss, he whispered. He wished he could hear something other than snoring. Ralpho could be right outside the door, and Bob wouldn't know it until the door started to open. Bob fumbled for his penlight and aimed it at the cabin door. He let out his breath. Okay, good. He could see what was coming now. So, now what? Should he just wait here for Ralpho to burst in and scare his family half to death? What kind of dad did that? Bob threw back the covers and got up. Wanda snorted and turned over. Cindy made a noise that sounded like a chortle. Bob shone his light on the door again. Should he check outside? Yes, you idiot, he told himself. Standing there in the dark wasn't accomplishing anything. Bob crossed to the chest of drawers between the bed and the window on the right side of the cabin. He felt around in the top drawer for a pair of sweats. Finding them, he pulled them on. Then he went to the cabin door and slipped on the sandals that were neatly lined up on a row of smaller sandals against the wall. He opened the door, tensing because he half expected to be smacked upside the head with a cymbal. But the cabin's small porch was empty. Bob looked out at the blackness that surrounded Cabin Nutter. He glanced up at the sky. No moon, no stars. Apparently, the clouds had come back. But what good were they at night? And where was that rain? It didn't matter. He was distracting himself from the matter at hand. Resisting the urge to turn on his penlight, Bob let his eyes adapt to the dark. It didn't take long for him to be able to pick out shapes. He could see the vague outlines of the nearest 3 cabins, and he could also see the vertical pattern of the woods at the edge of the camp. Between 2 of the cabins, a handful of distorted shapes baffled Bob until he remembered a rustic playground was situated there. Bob saw a small spark of light in the playground area. He froze. Was that Ralpho? What if that was Ralpho using a penlight like Bob's? Bob strained to see in the dark. Then he realized he was looking at the glowing end of a cigarette. Good. Rabbits don't smoke. Bob contained a burst of laughter. Rabbits didn't smoke. Was Cabin Nutter really making him nuts? Ralpho wasn't a real rabbit. Bob watched the minuscule circle of light. It rose and lowered a couple of times. Then Bob realized he could just make out the outline of a man. A man, not a rabbit. Closing the cabin door behind him, Bob stepped off the cabin's porch. He headed across the 100 feet or so from his cabin to the lit cigarette. The early morning air was cool and heavy with the thickly sweet scent of the woods and the fresh scent of recently cut grass. Dew moistened Bob's toes as he walked. Away from his snore-ridden cabin, Bob could hear night sounds more clearly. Crickets were industriously chirruping. Okay, what? He also heard the rustle and crack of tree branches bending to the will of the wind that had apparently started blowing during the night. As Bob neared the tiny flicker of light, he heard a man's feet shuffle against rocky ground, and then a loud sigh. "Hello there," Bob called out softly. The tiny light jerked. "Sorry to startle you, I couldn't sleep." Bob listened to the man suck in the smoke, and then expel it. The smell of menthol made Bob's nostrils twitch. "Me neither," the smoker said unnecessarily. A flashlight clicked on, and the smoker shined a beam of light onto his face. It made the smoker look sinister, especially with smoke pouring out of his nose, but Bob could tell the guy was probably pretty normal looking in the daytime. He had a thick head of light-coloured hair, and he had what might be blue eyes. The eyes, though, looked sad. Bob flicked on his penlight and shined it on his own face. He chuckled. "Not our best sides, huh?" The smoker appeared to smile. It was hard to tell. The macabre effects of his flashlight turned the smile into a sneer. "I'm Bob." Bob offered his hands. "Philip." Philip took the last drag of his cigarette and pinched it out between his 2 fingers before taking Bob's hand and shaking it. Bob felt a little intimidated by the pinching a lit cigarette move, but he told himself to grow up. Aiming his light around, he saw that Philip was leaning against the end of the swing set. Bob was tempted to take a seat in one of the swings, but then he'd feel even more like a little boy than he already did. "You stand up for the bunny call too?" Philip asked. Bob's breathing sputtered like a guttering candle. He had to run his tongue around inside his mouth before he answered. "Yeah." Philip flicked his lighter on and off, then stuffed it in his pocket. "Probably not my best decision." His expression... Oh God, what was that? His expression seemed a little severe for the situation, didn't it? "I've been awake most of the night thinking about it," Bob admitted. He looked at his watch. "What's the time?" Philip asked. It's 5:08, Bob said. Why doesn't time crawl when things are going right? Bob didn't answer. What was the point? So he stood in the dark with Philip and listened to the wind. He also listened to the ticking of an imaginary clock. It ticked louder than any real clock Bob had ever heard. Ralpho could show up at any minute. The men listened and waited. Bob's intestines felt like battling serpents flailing around inside his belly. Bob was seconds from throwing up, but he managed to get himself under control. The serpents slid back down into his gut, but it didn't stop writhing. My mum collected stuff, Bob said. Philip shifted at the unexpected words. His back chuffed against the swing set. Bob was surprised too. He didn't know he was going to say out loud what he was thinking about. Since he started though, he figured he'd finish. It was better than hanging out here waiting for an orange rabbit while his anxiety ate him alive from the inside. Her favourite collectibles were baskets and china teacups. An image of Bob's mother filled his mind. His mum had been old school and very feminine. She always wore pastel slacks and floral silk blouses, even on house cleaning day. She always tried to be the perfect wife. She'd kind of spoiled Bob, if he was being honest. He'd thought he had a life like his dad's. He'd come home from work, put his feet up and read the paper. Talk about culture shock. Not that Wanda wasn't a great wife. Bob remembered he was telling a story. She kept her most prized baskets on top of the hutch in the dining room, and the teacups were on top of the sideboard that was next to the hutch. Bob paused and listened to the wind. That was the wind, wasn't it? When nothing appeared out of the night, he continued. One day I thought it would be fun to see if I could throw my basketball up into one of her baskets. I have no idea why that seemed like a good idea. I was 9. Philip didn't say anything. The sense of urgency Bob had felt since he'd gotten out of bed suddenly multiplied tenfold. He rushed on with his story. So I tossed the ball up into a perfect arc. I'd been practicing and it lands in the biggest basket. I'm jumping around like I've won a tournament, making all the crowd noises, whooping and cheering. But then the ball starts to tip the basket, and the basket starts to go over. It happens in super slow motion, like a millionth of an inch per few seconds. Or at least that's how it seems. And then the basket is on its side, and the ball is on its way past the other baskets and on down the side of the hutch. I can see what's going to happen, and I'm in motion immediately. But there's no way I can stop it. The ball comes down and lands on the sideboard, scattering Mum's teacups all over the place. All but one of them broke. Mum was devastated. Bob stopped and cleared his throat. Once I made the decision, the rest of it was out of my control. He shook his head. I think I made a decision like that today with the bunny call. A loud half-baying, half-yelping cry sounded in the distance. Oh no!